Hi, this is Curt Gowdy. I'm sitting around here at camp after a very enjoyable day of hunting with Fred Bear, considered by most people the greatest archer hunter in America, also marvelous with a gun. I first met Fred through television outdoor series. Watched him in operation, had been with him. We struck up quite a friendship, and we hunt and fish together now. Fred, I know you've been all over the world. How'd you ever get started with your love for hunting?
Well, my father was a hunter. I grew up in a farm in Pennsylvania. My father was a hunter, and he had me shooting a gun when I was 6 years old.
This happens a lot of times. The father gets the boy interested, and it continues through the family.
It's a great combination, yes.
Well, you've hunted now over 40 years with a bow and arrow, with a gun, and I imagine all over the world you've had some exciting things happen to you. You probably had some close escapes. You've had a lot of wild incidents. You probably had some funny things. I'll bet you can really tell some stories.
Well, I've had some very interesting experiences, yes. Many of them. Some of them could have ended tragically. Fortunately, they didn't. Some of them ended rather humorously. I've been charged twice by polar bears. The Eskimo had to gun them down. I spent a night in a wet night, a wet, cold night in a tree with a grizzly bear wolfing down around the bottom. But I think the most interesting experience I had that could have turned out tragically was hunting black bears in Alaska with a friend of mine named Bob Munger. Well, actually, I wasn't hunting. I was doing photography. We were making a film, and Bob was hunting with a bow and arrow. It was in the spring of the year, and we had worked ourselves up onto a flat tundra lake area that was very flat, except that a little hammock here and there with some trees growing out of it. And we saw in one of these little clusters of trees a moose. We did a very good Indian sneaking job on him and get up to a good picture range, and I took quite a few pictures, and finally I had all I wanted. And normally, I like to sneak out in a case like that and take a little pride in having been able to do it without the animal seeing me, but in this case, Bob stood up and he waved his arms and yelled. He wanted to see the moose run off, but what we didn't know was this cow moose had a calf. And cow moose, when they have a calf, are sometimes dangerous, and this one took off after us. Well, my legs were a little longer than Bob's, and I quickly got the lead, and we were running through this soft tundra, shedding cameras and bows and arrows and whatnot. And about 200 yards away was a little hillock with one lone tree growing out of it that was not big enough for the two of us, and I got there first and laid claim to it. There had been another tree there that had died and blown over with the roots sticking up in the air, and there was a hole underneath it. So I yelled to Bob to duck in the hole, which he did. And when he was in the hole, the moose paid no attention to him, came over to the tree I was on, began bumping it with her shoulder, but I was high enough. Well, about that time, Bob is out of the hole, and the moose saw him and took him for a turn around the tree, and then he ducked back in the hole. And I couldn't understand why he didn't stay in there, but the moose came back to the tree then again, and then Bob is out of the hole again. And
kept ducking in and out of the hole.
Kept ducking in and out of the hole, yeah, and it didn't make sense, but he started off across the tundra, and I yelled to him. I said, "What's the matter with your head? Get in the hole and stay there." And he said, "I can't. There's a bear in there."
Oh, what a situation.
Yep.
I've seen you hunt polar bear. I saw a great show you shot in Alaska on the polar bear and the American Sportsman. And to me, it's amazing, that big white bear and that white ice floes up there, and you were all in white hood and coat to use as your camouflage, and how you killed that polar bear with a bow and arrow. When did you really get interested in bow and arrow hunting for big game?
When did I get interested?
Yeah.
As I told you, I learned to hunt with my father with a gun. And I hunted that way for about 20 years. And then I got interested in the bow and arrow. I killed the largest deer I ever saw or really heard of with the gun, and it was really kind of easy, and I decided I wanted a little harder way, so I took up the bow and arrow. And that's the way I got into the bow business. Yes, the polar bear is a magnificent animal. All bears have great dignity.
They do, you're right.
They have great dignity.
That's a good word.
And if you know that, you can escape trouble a lot of times. If you push a bear a little bit too much, then he may come at you. But if you just hesitate just a minute to allow a dignified retreat, you're not in trouble anymore. But there's one thing about bear hunting. First place, you shouldn't shoot female bears with cubs. And if you do mess around with them, then is when you're apt to get in trouble. The boar bear will rarely give you any trouble. He's, well, he hasn't any cubs to protect. He's strictly on his own, and he's only interested in saving his skin. But the female bears are the ones that give you trouble. The polar bear, I have great respect for. He can, out on that bleak ice pack, make himself a pretty good living. And he does it mostly by catching seals. And the seal will lie out in the sun by a hole, by an escape hole, with his nose right on it. And his head is up, looking around about 15 seconds out of every minute. He catnaps, so to speak, or seal naps.
He knows he's in danger.
He knows he's in danger, yes. And his head is up once a minute, and he scans the horizon, and it's down again.
Like the old, when the geese come into the cornfield, there's always one of them with his head looking around, and he's going to warn the other.
Yeah, but if there are a dozen seals in an area, they all have their heads up. Well, anyhow, the polar bear has to be a great hunter, and he must, with all his bulk and size, and with his black nose and black eyes and black claws, must sneak up close enough to spring on that seal before he can get down the hole, and that takes a lot of doing. The polar bear is a great hunter. He's the best hunter of all the animals I know of.
He really is.
Oh,
I wouldn't think that. He's so big and cumbersome, you'd think. Of course, I guess with a white body against the white snow, he must be stealthy and quiet, huh?
Well, the Eskimos say, they have the black nose, which is a giveaway. The Eskimos say in this sneak, which I've never seen, that they will cover their black nose with their paw so that the seals can't see them. That's a little hard to believe, but it could be possible. I don't know.
Fred, and you're hunting in North America. I know you love to hunt the white-tailed deer. Why?
Well, the white-tailed deer, in my opinion, is the smartest game animal that there is today.
That's going to surprise a lot of people.
Well, I say this, that anyone who can successfully hunt the white-tailed deer is qualified to hunt any animal. And the only difference in the hunting technique is brought about by the terrain, not the animal. Really, the sheep is supposed to be an exotic animal, and it is. Mm-hmm. And he's supposed to be real smart.
High altitude, rocky crags.
He is tough to get to, but he doesn't have the mental capacity that the white-tailed deer has. You must remember that the sheep is lying up on the side of a mountain, and he can see all around. But he can be approached from above very easily. His ears are not as good. His nose isn't as good. His eyes are excellent. They're probably beyond the white-tailed deer. But he can be approached. The only difference is the physical exertion to climb up to where he is. That's where the secret of sheep hunting. But actually, if you put a white-tailed deer up in that same position, he would be harder to approach than the sheep is.
He's that smart.
Yeah. See, the white-tailed deer can live near civilization. He can live. I have a buck living within 100 yards of my home in Grayling. And he's been there all during this deer season that's just now closing, and the hunters are running all over the woods. They won't hunt close to town because there can't be anything there, in their opinion. But this deer is smart enough to stick close to my house, and he's going to avoid the hunters. He's going to live through the winter.
Well, what are your tips to hunt white-tailed deer, then, if they're so smart?
Well, to hunt them with a bow, and also to hunt them with a gun. First, you must remember, in hunting with a bow, in most states, there is a separate earlier season to hunt with a bow and arrow. So that makes the hunting technique a little bit different than in the later gunning season, when the weather's different and when there are more hunters. In the bow season, there aren't too many hunters around, and the deer are pursuing their natural habits. They're walking trails, and they're going to a feeding ground, returning from it, and going to a bedding ground at approximately the same times. Not the same times every day, because that varies too. A deer is, well, all animals. Their movements are governed by their stomach, by food and water. Many people think that a deer will, most of them feed at night, or they do most of their feeding at night. They think they go out and feed all night, and then they go to a bedding area and bed down all night, or all day. Well, this is not so. In the feeding ground at night, they are up and down, and the cycle is roughly about 2 hours. They fill their stomach, and they digest it, and they're up filling it again. The same is true in the daytime when they're in the so-called bedding grounds. And the bedding grounds are thicker cover. They go in there for safety. They have learned from their association with man that he's not ramming around the woods at night. But in the daytime he is, and they better get in the thickest cover that they can. You can intercept these deer, and one of the ways that the archers do it is to find a runway or trail. And they build a blind along it, not too far away. The blind has to be maybe 20 yards, 25 yards away from the blind, from the trail, and downwind, of course, because the deer have a very powerful nose. The blind is built like you'd build a duck blind, with brush stuck up or logs or whatever material is available. You don't import any foreign material because the deer would see it. The blind has to be large enough so you can swing the bow, and the bow requires a lot more room than a gun, because you have to push it out at arm's length, and then you have to draw it back. The blind should be built low. In other words, don't fence yourself in and depend on looking through holes. The blind is to cover the lower part of the body, and the head should have you should have a good view, because it's important in all hunting to see your game first. That's one of the methods of hunting the white-tailed deer. And the blind hunting is good from daylight for about 2 hours, and the last 2 hours in the evening, because that is when deer are normally moving from the bedding ground to the feeding ground, or vice versa. During the remainder of the day, during the middle part of the day, and here is an instance where hunters don't quite understand all the time. They think that during the middle part of the day, that's the time you should go to camp or go home for lunch or take a nap. Really, you go into the bedding areas, and deer move about during that time. They don't go over to the feed ground. They move about and nip on grass or whatever food there is available during this middle part of the day. And it's to get a deer, you have to try and approach him when he's on foot. If he's lying down, it's pretty tough. They're hard to see. They're in the brush, and they will face downwind, so they can see you coming. If you're coming upwind.
About the wind, the children in this country have read about sneaking up with into the wind all the time, not at your back. This means something, right?
Well, yes, and it means something, and the deer know that. Actually, the deer think you can smell them, too. You must remember that, always. All animals, they can smell you, so they think you can smell them. Well, they watch downwind, and you're coming upwind. Actually, crosswind is a better way to hunt.
Crosswind? Crosswind
is a better way to hunt, yes. You have a little bit of an advantage there. Now, how to hunt other than the blind? Well, on the blind, of course, you build it and you sit there, and you have to sit quietly. You try to make your blind as comfortable as possible so you won't have to move around too much. And you just sit there and wait for a deer to come along. Now, that is not the most exciting way, but it is the most productive way to get a deer. The kind of hunting that I like, and the kind that is exciting, is known as still hunting, which simply means that you sneak around in the woods until you see an animal. And in the case of a gun, when you see it, you are usually close enough for a shot. But that's not true with the bull. When you see, let's say, a deer, uh, you're faced with the problem of getting close enough to it for the bow and arrow. And the bow and arrow range is 20 to 30 yards. Now, many animals are killed at great distances, a great deal larger than that, but the effective range of the bow, if you want to place your arrow where it should be, is 20 to 30 yards. And what you're doing, when you're still hunting, you're invading the domain of the deer. This is his home. He knows every path. He knows every tree, practically every leaf, and you don't. You're a stranger.
And he has superb senses.
Oh yes, and it's very difficult. One, the nose is the worst factor. The nose will give you away more times than the eyes and the ears put together.
Their scent.
Oh yes, yeah. And unless the wind is blowing strong, it can circle around, and very frequently does, in the woods, over the side of the hill or down in the pocket. You go down in the pocket, and the wind's blowing one direction. You get down in there, and it's swirling around in circles, so you have many problems there. But really, Curt, before you go hunting, now let's say you're going to go up to Michigan to hunt, or to New York or Maine or wherever you're going. You don't know the country, but you want to go up there and hunt deer. Well, you just don't go up there and park your car and start off hunting because there's some trees there. In every area of any size where there are deer, there are certain places in that area where there are more deer. And there are places in that area where there are no deer. And you have to find out, naturally, if you hunt in the area where the most deer are, your chances of success are going to be greater. So it's up to you to find where that area is. And how do you do it? Well, you ask questions of local people. You don't ask one question of one person and then do what he says. You take a cross-section and sort of try to sift the facts out of the information that you get. That helps. You travel about the country, in your car, if you like, on the old trails, and look for tracks and look for signs. You can see runways that are many times cut into the earth. Don't be taken in by the mere fact you found a runway, however, because that may have been a good spot last year and is not a good spot this year. Maybe last year there were no acorns and the deer were feeding along the edge of the swamp. Maybe this year there are acorns and they've moved over to where the oak trees are, and there won't be a deer on this runway once a week. So you find runways. In other words, you find evidence, and the evidence is in the form of tracks, fresh tracks, not old tracks. And when you find the greatest concentration of tracks, then that's the place to hunt.
There's some preparation of this, then.
Well, yes, it's like anything else. You simply have to use your head. Animals employ no magic. They just are governed by their senses, and they can be figured out in most cases, although when you get to a point where you think you're so good that you know what a deer will do, then your head has gotten a little too big for your hat, because that's the time they're going to do the opposite thing. So I never try to predict what a deer is going to do. I try to play the averages, and that's what you have to do when you're hunting. Actually, in my experience with the bow, the white-tailed deer is the hardest to kill. Very rarely do you see the picture book deer. Very rarely do you see the whole deer standing out in the open. As a general rule, you will, and it's important to see the deer before he sees you. That's a must. You practically have to see him before he sees you. Otherwise, he's alerted and he's watching for you, and you will never get close. You look for parts of a deer. You look for, in the woods, let's say, a horizontal line that could be a fallen log, except that it tapers off to a rounded back. Now, you can train your eyes, or your eyes, I should say, become trained after a certain amount of experience in the woods to bypass any horizontal line that's longer than a deer. Your eye doesn't dwell on it at all. You just pass it by. You look for an ear, a little off-color spot, maybe the tip of an antler. maybe the white of the inside of the legs. In the case of a whitetail, I've seen many deer by seeing just the white V of their tail. The underneath part of their tail is white, and a few white hairs stick out the side to give you a white V. You never look for the whole deer. Your progress in the woods when you're doing this still hunting, which is merely sneaking around as quietly as possible, when you're in cover where you can go quietly, you go very slowly. When you're in cover where it's not possible to go quietly, when there are a lot of leaves on the ground, let's say dry leaves, or when you have to cross an opening, you get it over with. If you're going through noisy cover, the best thing to do is to just barge right through and get it over with until you get into cover where it's quieter walking. The same is true with an opening. You get it over with. You should not walk through openings when you're hunting. In mountainous country, you should not walk the skyline because your silhouette can be seen by everything within eye range. You usually walk game trails. Two reasons for this. That's where you're more likely to see a deer, and that's where the footing will be more quiet. You can usually go the direction you want on a game trail by just going until you find one that goes in that direction, and the whole country is covered with game trails if there are game in the area. Hunting technique varies in your eastern and northeastern states, which includes some of the states of the Midwest. You're hunting in country that isn't mountainous and is usually rather thickly covered. There's lots of trees. When you get out in the western part of the country, beyond the Mississippi and out in the whole Southwest, where you have plains and mountains, then your hunting technique varies. In dry country, your water becomes almost important, or maybe more important in the eyes of the hunter than the food situation, because game has to have water. For instance, in hunting antelope, when I first went hunting antelope, they told me out in your hometown, by the way, Cheyenne, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That there's something wrong with my head. You can't get close enough to the antelope. All I did was build a blind like we spoke about at a water hole and waited for them to come in. I also found that you can't get close enough to an antelope with a bow and arrow in the open plains country, but there are always rough areas, broken up ridges and whatnot, adjacent to these where you can do a very good job of still hunting and sneak shooting the antelope. So you have to adapt yourself to the terrain, and you have to also remember that technique only varies with the type of country you're hunting in.